In this video, we're going to talk about how to make some collectibles that the player can pick up. So you can see here, if I go over here and I touch these little cube objects, you can see they get updated in the top left on our collectible count. And we'll talk about how we can set that up and have it talk to the UI and do a little bit of audio-visual feedback as we pick them up. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to tackle the collectibles themselves. And then once we get that functionality, we're going to do the UI system that will display the count at the top. First step is right-click, create a new blueprint class. This will be a type of actor because, again, this is not a character with, a skeleton or whatever, and it's not something that we can control. I think if you could control a collectible, that could be a very interesting game, but not for now. We're going to click on actor, just something that exists inside of our level. We're going to name it BP underscore collectible. Now, this is always a point of contention. Do you spell it with an IBLE or an ABLE? I've seen both ways. I'm going to do it IBLE. So we'll hit enter. We'll save it. Save selected. Save our new assets when we create them. And let's open this up. Let's double click it. And inside of here, we want to define the look of our collectible. Now, we know we need a few things, but one thing is some kind of visual associated. So I'm going to add a static mesh component by clicking this little add button up here. Type in stat and click on static mesh right there to complete it. And we want to define which static mesh that'll be. Now I'm going to keep mine real simple. I'm trying to use the starter content and defaults wherever I can so that we don't have to worry about a lot of external resources and things. So on our static mesh, one thing I think that it will consistently come with is a cube. So we're just going to start there. I'm going to click the drop down. After I click my static mesh, you'll see a drop down over here on static mesh and type in cube. You're going to see a lot of things pop up. I'm just going to click one of these, this top one right here, this cube. And if I zoom out a little bit by holding right mouse button and WASD, you're going to see this cube mesh. Now, I anticipate that this is going to be a little bit too big. If you weren't sure, you could always compile, save, and drag one into your scene. I think that would be good to do. And yes, that is going to be way too big. So let's resize that. Control S, come back in. All right, we're going to resize that and let's scroll up at the top and we're just going to scale down our static mesh. So we'll say 0.3, 0.3, 0.3. Let's see how that looks. Compile, save. That actually still looks too big, I think. Let's press play, look at it in the level. Okay, yeah, it's still going to be too big. So we could adjust this if you like. I would put this on the plane that we're working in. So this is a side scroller, so I'm just going to zero out. I'm thinking that I want it to be about half of that size as well. So let's go back in, blueprint. Let's do 0.15, 0.15, 0.15. Now, yours may look different because I think there might be multiple different cubes that are referenced over here. I would say test it in your scene. Whatever static mesh you're using, test it in your scene. Control S. And you could actually have your own static mesh, right? You don't have to use a cube if you don't want. Just be consistent with whatever your collectible is. I think that's going to look about right. So let's see that. Yeah, that's about right. Okay, escape. Another thing that we may want is our visual to look a little shinier and nicer. I'm going to make a new material for my little cube thing. So I'm going to minimize. I'm going to make a new material. In a larger game, you probably want to make material instances off of a type of material. But again, I'm trying to keep this pretty simple. Right click, go to material. I'm going to call this M underscore collectible. Save all, save selected. I'm going to double click my material. The material editor can get very complex. I'm really not going to focus that on my tutorial today. All I'm going to do is give it a base color and some kind of emissive. So to do that, I'm just going to right click and I'm going to type in V for vector parameter. This is if I wanted to change the color with the material instance later. Don't worry about it, but color is something that I would often want to choose and modify later. So I'm going to make that a vector parameter. We'll call this color. And we will plug in the result into base color. Additionally, I could just plug this directly into emissive color right there, and you'll see nothing really is happening because it's black. So we'll go over here and let's change this to a yellow. We'll click over here and change that, pull up the alpha as well. Okay, that's pretty good. Honestly, that'll be fine. If you wanted to change the amount of emissive, you could actually multiply this by a certain amount. If you want to do that, you can just create a constant here. So I think it's hold 1 and click. Yeah, 1 on your keyboard, or you could right click and find constant and create that there. But I'm just going to right click and type multiply like that. And all I'm doing here is I'm multiplying the result of this and 1 with a value and the other, and plugging the result into the emissive, right? And so this just allows you to control the amount of emissive if you want, but it's at 0 right now, which is no emissive. Let's crank this up to like 2 maybe, and you'll see it's very emissive. We're gonna put this down to 1. This is the default. So you can control this a little bit more if you want. That's the only reason we did that. And if we wanted to expose this, we could make this a parameter 2. So let's delete that and type in param and look for scalar parameter like that. That just creates our same constant, but now we can expose it into other things if we want. So like potentially if we made a material instance of this material, then we would be able to see the parameter color and the parameter value right here. So again, I'm kind of going a little bit too deep even at this point. We'll default this to 2, I think. We'll plug it in and do emissive color, and we'll call that done for now. Let's hit save. Sometimes you may want to hit apply and then save, just depending. We'll minimize that. We'll close this tab out. We don't need that. We'll save. We need to actually apply this material onto our collectible over here. So if I open up my blueprint collectible, we can actually use this cube, but apply a different material to it because I don't know what the cube is getting pulled from. So let's not deal with that. Type in the name of the material just created, m_collectible. There we go. So we're using this mesh and putting this material onto it. Compile save. So this is going to be the look of our collectible. We minimize that and come back into the scene. We can preview it. Awesome. Awesome. Let's actually duplicate a couple of these. So hold Alt and pull out that. Control S to save our scene. Come back in. And now we have the look of our collectible and it's in the scene. We just need to continue to add the functionality. So let's create a box overlap for our collectible. Now, if you come up here and you type add and you type in box collision, you can actually make this as big as you want. I actually like that default that it made, but if you wanted to resize it, I would come over here into box extent and just resize that however you like. One thing I would recommend is to make it slightly bigger than the box mesh itself or whatever your mesh is, because you don't want the player to feel like they have to perfectly touch it. You want it to have a little bit of padding here so that they can be in the rough vicinity and it would still collect. So I would recommend doing that. You probably want to also check your static mesh over here and make sure that your collision is set to block all dynamic. I would change that to no collision because I don't want my collectible mesh to block the player at all. I just want to detect if it entered this other box collision that we set up. And in this case, I just want them to pass through and we'll collect it. I don't want any kind of blocking with my collectible. Now, another thing that I think I want is I want to make this rotate over time. And I want that to look a little bit more visually interesting because if you compile save, come back in your scene and we hit play, they're just kind of sitting there, right? But nothing's really happening. We can jump through them or whatever. We haven't collected them yet, but they're not really interesting. So let's come back in here and hit add, and we'll type in rotating movement. That's what we want. And this rotating movement will allow it to spin. It's just a little component that you can easily add to things. By default, it will rotate along 180, and that'll be like a vertical spinning across the vertical axis. But I think we can make it more interesting than that. I'm actually going to put 100 into all 3 of these fields, so it will spin in kind of a diagonal weird direction. So if you put 100 and the rotation rate in XYZ, it'll spin along all of those axes. So hit compile save, come over here and test it out. All right, pretty cool. I think that'll work. And now we actually need to add the ability to pick these up and the functionality for collecting them. So let's go back into our blueprint. We'll open that up. And I want to put the functionality inside of the event graph. So let's click on the event graph. And I want access to my box collision so that we can test for overlap and test if it's the player. And if so, then we can start to collect it. So select your box collision. And with that selected, if you scroll down on the right side, you'll see all these events that we have access to that are related to this component. I'm going to click on component begin overlap. So now we will get an event call when this component is overlapped by something else. So when this happens, we want to test the other actor to see if it is the player pawn that we're controlling. So first I'm going to get access to the player pawn. We'll right click and say get player pawn. And we'll pull off of that. We'll do equals. Okay, I usually just hold Alt disconnect, reconnect it back into this one. So then we can pull the other actor that overlaps with this collision. We can make sure that it's the same as the player pawn, so the player character. We have our comparison here. We'll pull off of our execution node because next we want to test, kind of like an if statement, like if it is this thing. So we'll call it a branch. It's called a branch node. Pull this over here. We'll connect the result of if we're comparing our other actor that ran into this box collision. If it is the same as the player pawn, then we'll return true, and that will be the result of our condition. If it's not, it'll return false, right? So if these are the same, then it's true, then we want to collect this thing. So let's actually pull off of this and say print string, and the string we want to print is collected. And we'll pull that up to get that out of the way. And then in addition to collecting it, we want to destroy this actor. I'm going to destroy the actor that this event graph is responsible for. So target self, destroy this thing. So in other words, destroy the collectible, right? And then later on, we can replace the print string with our logic for counting the collectible somewhere, which we haven't done yet. So hit compile, save. And if we see this collected and we destroy it, then we know that we're good so far. So I would test that before continuing. Let's compile, save, go back in, Control S, play. All right. Run over here. We pick these up and we see collected over there in the top left, right over here. Okay, so we're good. So now we actually need to put the logic for incrementing a collectible count somewhere. And what you should be thinking at this point is what should be responsible for the collectible count? And depending on your game type, this answer might be different. For me, I think that the collectible count should exist on the player stats, not the character. There are some things that might be owned by the character. For example, health. What is the health on this particular character in the scene? How much ammo do they have? How much money are they carrying, right? But in my case, I think something like a score might belong to the player outside of this character. So what if we had, a respawn system where you could collect things and your character dies and then you're respawn somewhere else? We don't necessarily want to get rid of things that the player has already obtained. Now, maybe you do, maybe you don't. A lot of tutorials may put this on the character if it makes sense. I'm going to put this collectible count on the player controller because it makes more sense for the logic of my game. I want to collect things and hold on to them outside of the character themselves. We could also argue that maybe the collectible accounts are being held by the character and they might be dropped if we don't save those off in a checkpoint or something later on. That would be a more advanced system. I just want to show you how you can store things on the player controller if they're game-wide and if it makes sense. So to do this, it's pretty simple. Just make sure that you verify what player controller you're using. And you can do that if you hit the play button and you scroll down, you can see BP_SS player controller. This is a custom player controller that I created just by, coming down here and right-clicking blueprint, and I created my own player controller right there. I'm not going to do that again because I have other functionality on it, but if you wanted to create your own, that's how you would do it. And you could have other functionality on there. So if I right-click, you can see I've already put other things on the player controller. That's fine. Again, you could actually do this on the character if you want, but your code's going to look a little bit different. If you are going to do it the player controller, how I'm going to do it, that you are actually creating that and hooking that up, so it's actually using that in the game mode that you're using. I've done this in other tutorials, but set up your game mode, make sure that that game mode is hooked up to your player controller, however you need to, and we're going to put the code there. So if we open up our SS player controller, I'm going to keep track of the collectible count in here. So to do that, I'm going to create a new variable. So if you come down here inside the player controller, hit plus for a new variable. We'll call this collectible count. Hit enter. We're going to make this a type of integer and we'll compile save. I'm also going to hit this little eyeball so that other things can see it. All right, so now we have our variable on our player controller, and what we want to do is we want to increase the value of this variable from our collectible when it's picked up. So let's compile, save, minimize. We'll come over here into our collectible. Instead of printing the string, we actually want to increase the value of our collectible. So let's actually delete this string right here. And after our comparison, first thing we need to do is we need to get access to the player controller. So get player controller. Again, if you put this somewhere else, you need to get access to that thing that, if it's the character or whatever, and pull off of that. And now I need to cast it to the certain type of player controller that I'm using. So in my case, it's the SS player controller, not just the generic base player controller. You know, if you're putting it on the character, you need to cast to the type of character. So you say get player pawn and cast to that blueprint player pawn or whatever. So I'm going to pull off of that and say cast to player BP underscore SS player controller. Hit enter. So it's the same one as where we put the variable over here. Pull that up. Now we'll connect it to true. So if true, we'll find the player controller. We will cast it. And now we need to add the logic to increment the collectible count. This is going to look a little bit weird at first, but basically we need to get the current amount and add to it. Now there's other special nodes for like, you know, plus plus increment or whatever. I'm just going to show you how you can do it the normal way so that if you wanted some collectibles to be worth a different amount, you could set that up later instead of just adding one to it. So the first thing we need to do is we need to get the current amount and then add an amount to it. So as BP SS player controller, we'll pull off of that. We'll say get collectible count. So we'll get the collectible count, and then we want to add an amount to that. So if we pull off of that, we'll say add, and then down here in operators, we'll click on add. All right, so then we can add an amount to it. It defaults to 0. In this case, we're going to change the 0 to a 1 because we want to add 1. But again, you could make this a variable and then plug this over here inside of our collectible as a collectible value amount, or like how much is this collectible worth? And you could add that if you like. I'm just going to add 1. And then the result of this, we're going to plug into a set. Right? So we're going to move this over a little bit. We're going to set the collectible account. Now you'll notice if I start typing that in, we're not going to see it because we need to get access to the player controller and set it from there. So if we pull off of as BP SS player controller, and now we say set collectible account, we'll see it there. So it's important to know that you need to be accessing the actual thing where it exists in order to be able to see it. So make sure you pull off of that, set it, and now we can plug this into there. We also need to execute this node, right? This call to set the amount. So it looks kind of weird here, but that's what it's doing. We're getting access to it, getting the current amount, adding one to it, and plugging the result into also access it, the result of this variable. So then we pull that in. For now, you know, we could actually, for testing, we could print that out. Let's do that real quick. We'll pull over here. We'll print string. We want to print the new amount, the new current amount of our collectible count, and then destroy. Compile, save. Come back over here, hit play. And now we should see the amount over there in the top left when we pick these up. 1, 2, 3. Okay, great. So we're doing that. We don't really have any feedback systems and we don't have any UI, but for now we know that our collectible amount is increasing when we pick up the collectibles and they're destroying. So far this is working as we intend. Okay, so now that we have our collectible functionality and our visual set up, we need to add the audio visual feedback for when we touch them, because right now, see, nothing really happens right there. We want that to feel a little bit more interesting. So we're going to add some sounds and a particle system burst. So let's actually start off with a sound. You can always go to a website like Chiptone and make your own sound through the browser and export it as a WAV file. You can also make your own. You can find a free sound somewhere if you like. I just made a temporary one from Chiptone and it's going to sound like this. Just really simple, like a Mario coin pickup style thing. So once you get your sound, I'm going to drag and drop my sound over into here. So take your sound and drop it into the content browser. And this is my default sound, right? I want to make a sound cue out of that. So we'll just really quickly make that. First, I'm going to save all. Since I added a new asset, I'm going to click on my sound, right click and say create cue. Okay, so we have our collect cue. If I open that up, what I want slight randomization on the pitch and the volume when I collect that sound. Let me pull that out. This is called a modulator. So if I drag in a modulator, I can take my sound effect, plug it into the modulator, and put the output into our final output. And if you click on modulator, you can actually pick a random minimum and maximum for both the pitch and the volume. I actually think the default is fine, so you can test it out with play cue. You see how it sounds slightly different? That's actually what we want. So I'm going to save that. That way it just doesn't sound exactly the same for each one and avoids a little bit of that repeated sound effect thing. So once we have our sound completed, we're going to go into our blueprint for our collectible over here. And I'm actually going to put this in the collectible blueprint right here, BP underscore collectible, because we may have different kinds of collectibles and each might have a different kind of sound, for example. So we come inside this blueprint. Let me maximize that. Right before we destroy our actor, I want to play the sound. So the way to do that is you can right click and say play sound at location or 2D. I'm going to say 2D. That way we'll hear it the same volume no matter how far away the camera is. We might have some camera zooming or something later on. So we have our play sound 2D. We'll plug that in. We'll still connect our print string. We'll get rid of this later so that we're going through this node. And then we want to select a sound asset. Now we can choose the sound itself or we can choose the cue. I'm going to look for the cue. So I think we call that collect cue, right? So this one has a randomization and this is just the base sound wave. So I'm going to choose the cue. Okay, compile, save. We'll test it out real quick. Inside of play mode, hit play. All right, we'll come over here. We should hear the sounds. Cool. All right, so we have our sound effects. Let's actually add a simple little particle burst. Now, I'm not going to go in depth into the Niagara system. It's very complex. We're just going to do the simplest possible burst just to communicate it, and then an effects artist can go and make that look nicer later on. Actually, let's go into the effects folder. We'll right-click and choose Niagara System. We'll choose the top option, New System from Selected Emitters. This will allow us to customize it a little bit from the base. Hit Next. And I'm going to choose, let's see, an omnidirectional burst. You may see new options by the time you do this. I'm not really sure. But basically, we want the particles to come outwards from a point. So I'm going to select omnidirectional burst, hit the plus button. So we'll get that inside of our system. Hit Finish. We'll call this FX underscore collect. I always like to save my assets once I make them. So save all, save selected. Let's customize this slightly. Again, we're going to do this real quick and not really worry about how it looks, just that it generally bursts outwards. So all I'm really going to do here is I'm just going to click on initialize particle and I'm just going to change the color. And I'm going to change this to something similar to our collectible, something like that. Okay, you can see the preview down here. Just simple yellow burst outwards. I think that's good enough as a placeholder. So we'll close that out. So now we want that to spawn and play when we collect, when we hear the sound effect as well. So let's open up our blueprint on our collectible over here, BP collectible. When we play the sound, let's also spawn a system. So we'll drag out, we'll say spawn system. Let's see, at location. And we can hover over this node. It'll tell us spawn to Niagara system. And then we can have it auto destroy, auto activate. All those things are fine. I would just leave it at default, but we want to play this at the current location of the collectible when it's collected. So we're going to right click and say get actor location like that. This will get the location of the target, which in this case, it's this thing that it's attached to. Let's connect that into the location just like that. So it'll spawn at that position. And we actually need to select the appropriate system too. So click this drop down and it'll give you all the ones there. I just know it's collect, or you can search for it if you like. Compile, save. So it'll play the sound, spawn it, and then destroy the actor. And our particle will handle itself because it'll auto destroy and auto activate. Okay, compile, save if you haven't already. Minimize, come back in, hit play. Let's test it out. Okay, so that's a little bit better. Obviously, we can continue to polish that later. For now, I just want the feedback that the mechanic is working, and that's all I care about for now. Next, we're going to create a UI widget that will display our current collectible count and then respond appropriately when we pick up our collectibles so we can see how many we have gathered. To do that, first we need to create a new widget for it. So let's right click, go to user interface and widget blueprint. You can click on user widget, that's fine. And we'll call this widget underscore player info. Now, the reason I'm calling it that is because I may want my collectible count to be part of a larger widget that contains other player information. I can always add that to my widget over here if I like. So we can save all, save selected. You could always call it widget underscore collectible count if you want. You just have more widgets in that case. So once you create it, let's double click. Remember, it's player info. So widget underscore player info. We'll open that up. It defaults in the designer view, which is what we want. In this case, the graph is if we wanted to add functionality, we'll just stay in the designer view. And on our widget, first of all, we want a canvas. So this will display it to the screen. We'll drag and drop this down in our hierarchy right there. So now we have our canvas. We also want the text that we want to change to represent our collectible count, like the number for it. And I'm actually going to put a little image right next to it to indicate what that thing is. So I don't have to label it collectible. I'll just have a little yellow square to call that collectible. So let's actually do the square first. I think in this case, I'm just going to keep it real simple and just do an image. So I'll search for image, click and drag under the canvas panel. It's kind of a weird rectangle right now. I'm just going to resize that, I think, to do that over in slot over here. Instead of 130, I'm going to change this to 50 and 50, I think is fine. Put that up in the corner. If you decide to put this in a different corner, you probably need to re-anchor this to the nearest corner, I think is good practice. And we'll try to make this square the same color as my collectible. Like long term, you could replace this with your own little icon or graphic if you like, but I'm just trying to be really simple and straightforward with all this right now. So we'll change it. Something like that I think is fine. And then we'll put our text right next to this to represent the current number of collectibles that we have. So to do that, we're going to clear our search field over here, and we will now search for text. See rich text block or text. I think text is fine. We'll drag that in. All right. One thing is I want to just double check and make sure it's aligned to the left, and it is, because I want my number to start on this side and expand outwards. And let's replace this text with some placeholder stuff. So let's find out. Over here in text and content, we'll just say 000, just so we can visualize what that will look like. You can resize it here too if you want, but I think this is fine for me. This is our current collectible count. Now, what we want to do is we want to tie this text field to represent the current collectible count in our variable. Now remember, in this case, our variable holding our collectible count is in the player controller. So just to remind you, over here in my SS player controller, as we set up earlier, we created this little variable down here for our integer, and we want to take the current value of our collectible count and put that into the UI widget. Now there's a couple ways you can do this, but I'm going to use something called binding, which is where we select our text once we have it set up and customized. Go over to the right of the text field, and I want to bind this field to something. So if we do a little drop down and say create binding, you can see that it actually creates a function over here called getText_. You can relabel that if you want. I'm just going to keep it there for now, but that's where it's getting called and what it's referred to. So over here, what we're saying is when this text is accessed, we want to do some functionality and return a new amount. So in order to return the current collectible count and plug that into our return value, we have to get access to the player controller, cast to it, and get it, convert it to text, and put it in there. Like take the collectible count from that and plug it into the return value as text. So what does that look like? If we right click, we'll say get player controller. So we can easily get the player controller from anywhere. This is what holds our collectible count. Well, kind of. This would if we were to cast it, because this is the base player controller, but we want a specific type because we created a BP_SS player controller, and that's where our collectible count is. So we want this specific type of player controller. So we're going to cast that. We're going to drag off and say cast to BP_SS player controller. Yours might be called something different. This is my custom player controller that I made. Yours might have a different name. So what I want to do is plug in the execution node. We'll get our player controller, cast it, and then on success, we'll return. But now we need to actually give it the return value. So we need to, as BP SS player controller, this is mine, yours might be different. We'll pull off of that and say get collectible count. All right, now this is an integer and we need to return a text. We can actually convert an integer into text. If we plug it in automatically, it'll give us that conversion, but you could also, call the conversion to text integer and plug that in. Some of these kind of conversions are automatic inside of blueprints, which is very helpful. Okay, so when we try to get the text and access it to display it, we are getting the player controller, testing to see if it is the SS player controller, and if it is, then we want to get the collectible account from that, the current amount, and return it. So if we compile save, we have our functionality set up, but what we still need to do is create the viewport on our player controller, because our widget is handling all this logic, but it's not ever actually getting rendered to the camera. So to do that, I'm going to hop over into my BP_SS player controller that has my collectible account that we were looking at earlier. Now I have other code here. That's fine. You may have other code too. I'm just going to move this around. What I want is on begin play, I want to create the widget and add it to the viewport. So right when we begin playing, right, event begin play, we're going to pull off of that, say create widget, okay, create widget. We want to choose the widget we want to create, and that's going to be the one we just created. Mine was called widget_player_info. And we shouldn't need to plug anything in here since it's single player and we're in the player controller. I'm just compiling as I go, just muscle memory. And then we're going to add the widget that we just created to the viewport. So we'll say add to viewport. And what we're going to add to the viewport is this widget that we just created. So we also need to connect the return value, which is this widget that I just created. This is the target. This is the widget we want to add to the viewport. If we compile save, I think we can test it out and it should be good. Let's minimize, hit play, go through, we run. Okay, and you can see the numbers up at the top left were next to the image that we created. So we have our viewport working. Last little cleanup I'm going to do here is I'm going to get rid of the text that we had, our print string. And I think that was in the collectible, BP_collectible. Okay, so we're just going to remove this print string, connect the node. And once we set it, we're fine there. We don't need to do anything else with that. We can bump this together if we like. If you wanted to refactor here, you could. So for example, if I wanted to refactor this, I could say, I could highlight my play sound and my spawn system and my get actor. And if we right click, we can go to collapse to function and we could call this play FX if we like. And so now this is isolated into a separate function. We could double click and see more there. You could always clean up your code this way if you like, but I want to show you how you could do that. So we'll drag this over, drag that over, and one last compile save. I think we're good. I think let's do one last quick test. Right over here, you can see our widget in the top left is spawning. You can see it updates. Okay, and we could always do more things there, like put little animations and bursts and little bobs and pops and things if we want to inside of our UI. But I think for now we have our collectible mechanic working, and this lets us start to build out our game. And I think this is fine for now. So this is our collectible mechanic, and thank you for watching.